the two halves of doing textual criticism involve examining the external evidence and examining the internal evidence. External evidence has to do with looking at the actual physical evidence, the manuscripts, the versions, the quotations by the church fathers, and assessing it in terms of the age of the witness, how old that witness is, in terms of the character. We might have a manuscript, for example, an early papyrus P75, the scribe probably did a private copy for himself. The Greek writing it looks like chicken scratches. It's not really elegant, but it was an extremely faithful copy in a very, very good tradition. He seems to have copied out no more than one letter, maybe two letters at a time, max. And so the age of the manuscript, the quality of the manuscript, those are the kinds of things we're looking at. And then that contrasts with, say, Codex D, Bezae, known as Controburgiensis. It was a manuscript that Theodore Beza gave to the University of Cambridge in 1581. And that manuscript, the scribe copies out as many as 9 words at a time. So 1 or 2 letters versus 9 words. Well, which one's going to be a more accurate text for us to think about, Then you're looking at the date and character of these manuscripts. You're comparing the oldest witnesses to each other in various geographical locales, because if you have a variant that occurs, say, in the 3rd century in Carthage and in Rome and in Caesarea and in Antioch, we say, well, now we've got some areas where these manuscripts are agreeing. Why would they agree if they're so geographically disparate, unless they go back to something that's even earlier? And then you're looking at what's called genealogical solidarity within each kind of local or regional, local original. You're looking at the copies to see how good they were of that text. I like to use the illustration, because I grew up in Southern California, of if somebody wrote in the newspaper that the 49ers beat the Rams. Now, when I grew up in Southern California, the Rams were always beating the 49ers. So you'd say, well, this guy's probably not from around here. He's from San Francisco, and he just got his facts wrong because he loves the 49ers. Nowadays, it's the reverse. But I don't know if that illustration's actually going to work. Let's just scrub that. It does in an oral presentation of what I typically do. Let's just talk about genealogical solidarity, what that means a little bit externally. This is a long question to answer. It's not real easy to do.
Okay.
So genealogical solidarity means that the texts of the New Testament grew up in major areas where they had kind of local originals, if you will. They kept getting copied over and over and over again. We don't have those local originals, some of which go back to the 2nd century, some to the 3rd or 4th century, but we do have the copies of those. And so, for example, if you look at the 5 copies of the Gettysburg Address, when they all agree on the wording, and then we read the newspaper accounts where people heard what Lincoln had to say, and it agrees on the same wording, we can be pretty sure that's what Lincoln really said, and that's what Lincoln really wrote. So those are the kinds of things that's genealogical solidarity. And so that's external evidence. Comparing, sifting all the data. We do not count manuscripts. We weigh manuscripts. That's the important thing about it, the external evidence. But then you compare that to the internal evidence, and that has 2 halves to it. One is called intrinsic evidence, and the other is transcriptional evidence. Intrinsic has to do with what an author would be likely to have written, and based on the context, based on the author's style, based on his motifs, his theology, things like this. And transcriptional evidence has to do with what a scribe would be likely to have written. Now, that sounds really, really subjective, but it really isn't. It's subjective to a degree, but first of all scribes made mistakes. If you handwrite out a gospel, you will make mistakes too. There's nobody who's not going to make mistakes on that. And so when you have these scribes making mistakes, this is the most common kind of a scribal error, is an unintentional change. And those are the very easiest ones for us to detect and to figure out what was there. For example, if I read a manuscript that was a preamble to the Constitution of the United States, and it said, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion." You go, onion? What's the matter with that guy? He knows the word is cucumber, So we would know that's an unintentional mistake. He puts an O instead of a U. Those kinds of mistakes are rampant, and they're easy to detect. So you're comparing the transcription evidence, what a scribe would be likely to do, and then what sounds like the most subjective, and in many places it is, intrinsic evidence. What is the author likely to have written? But it's not subjective, or not nearly so, when you're dealing with a larger amount of material. For example, Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, those 12 verses, there's virtually a consensus among New Testament scholars that Mark did not write those 12 verses. Well, why do they say that? Well, we have external evidence. Our earliest and best manuscripts don't have them, although the vast majority of manuscripts do have those 12 verses. Without them, you don't have any resurrection appearance of Jesus to his disciples. He's raised from the dead, but he doesn't appear to them. And then you've got the intrinsic and the transcriptional evidence. What would a scribe be likely to do? He would be likely, if he has an account of Mark's gospel without a resurrection appearance by Jesus, to put one in. In fact, there were 5 different endings to Mark's gospel that were added by various scribes. This is not the only one. And so what would the author be likely to do? Well, we have to judge that on the basis of his vocabulary, his syntax, things like that. And a recent doctoral dissertation done at Dallas Seminary went through all of the intrinsic evidence for all 5 endings. And the scholar by the name of Greg Sapaw came to the very firm conclusion that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is not by Mark. So that's how we put all this together.